We're here at Mount Diablo, and Mount Diablo is a place that is really special to me because I grew up actually 30 minutes south of here. I grew up in the Tri-Valley, and I remember when I was younger looking up at Mount Diablo and just being in awe because this mountain is incredible. You could see it from everywhere you are. You know, when I was in high school, I'd drive up the hill to my school and I'd look out across the Tri-Valley and I'd see Mount Diablo right there. Or like if I drove up to Sacramento to visit my dad where he lived, I could look south and see Mount Diablo right there. You know, if I was in Stockton or the Central Valley, I'd look and I'd see Mount Diablo. Mount Diablo was always this picture of home. It was like home base for me. I always knew where home was by where Mount Diablo was. I could kind of calibrate my life around it. And I don't know if you know this about Mount Diablo. I heard this fact. I don't know if it's actually true. I can't really verify it. So I don't want to feed you fake news, so don't quote me on this. But I did hear that at the top of Mount Diablo, if you look out, it's the second longest continuous view in the world, which means you can see more land from the top of Mount Diablo than anywhere else in the world because it's so far above every other place in the surrounding area. And see, that's what the resurrection is for us Christians. It is that event that sticks out more than any other event. In fact, every event in the Bible is calibrated around this one event. Everything that happened before, from Genesis all the way through to the Gospels, and then from Acts all the way through to Revelation, whether you're looking back from Revelation or you're looking forward from Genesis, every single story in the Bible is calibrated around this one event. And in fact, our lives as Christians are calibrated around the resurrection. It's the most important event of any other event that we have in our walk with God. We look to the resurrection as that symbol of hope for us. And what's cool about the resurrection is these gospel writers that wrote about the resurrection, they wrote specific people into the story as eyewitnesses to this event. You know, let's take somebody like Joseph of Arimathea. If you know the story about the resurrection or the death of Jesus, you know that Jesus' body was put into the tomb of a man by the name of Joseph of Arimathea. Now, Joseph of Arimathea was a very public figure. What do we know about him? Well, first off, we know his name is Joseph. Second off, we know that he's from Arimathea. We actually know his hometown. But thirdly, we know that Joseph sat on what's called the Sanhedrin, which was a group of 70 Jewish men that met in Jerusalem. I mean, this guy was a public figure. So if you wanted to know about the story of Jesus, if you wanted to know about the resurrection and the facts surrounding it, well, all you had to do was go to this guy Joseph and ask him about it. I mean, he knew where the tomb was. It was his own tomb. And so if you wanted to find the body of Jesus, all you had to do was go to Joseph, ask him where the tomb was, and open it up. And what we know is the Romans, they had all the motive in the world to go and find the body of Jesus because they wanted to squash Christianity, but they never did. I mean, they had the address to where Jesus was. Why didn't they go and find the body of Jesus? Well, because the body of Jesus wasn't there. And we know that for a fact. In fact, most historians believe that. Now, what I'm going to do is, before we even jump into all the facts, I want to just set a ground level for us, okay? These are the minimal facts that almost every single historian and New Testament scholar can all agree upon, whether they're Christians or non-Christians. There's a guy by the name of Gary Habermas, and he's a theologian and scholar on the resurrection. And he's combed through all sorts of work, and here's what he says are the consensus facts scholars who are Christians and non-Christians all can agree upon. Here they are. He looked at 1,400 documents produced by Bible scholars, Christian and non-Christian, written between 1975 and 2003. And here's what he said are the facts that are universally agreed upon. Number one, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Everyone agrees about that. Number two, he was buried in a private tomb. Number three, the disciples were down, discouraged, and lost hope. Number four, the tomb of Jesus was found empty soon after his death. Number five, the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual experiences of the risen Jesus. That's important. Number six, the disciples' public testimony of the resurrection took place in Jerusalem, the city where Jesus had been crucified and buried a short time before. Number seven, they were willing to die for their belief, and many did. Number eight, James, the brother of Jesus, was a skeptic before this and was converted when he believes he saw the risen Jesus. So, with all those facts on the table, what's the most logical conclusion about what actually happened during this event. What's the most logical conclusion that we can come to? Now, there's a lot of different arguments out there, and I'll just tackle the easiest ones for now. The hallucination theory. Well, the hallucination theory basically says that everybody who saw the risen Jesus actually were just hallucinating. And there were mass hallucinations that were happening. But here's the problem. Hallucinations don't happen like that. In fact, what you're saying is that these apostles, all 12 of them who saw Jesus, or I guess technically 11 because Judas, you know what happened, they saw the risen Jesus, but they were all hallucinating. But then these women at the tomb, they were hallucinating too. Well, then the 500 people in the first chapter of the book of Acts, they were hallucinating too. And then these skeptics, James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul of Tarsus, they were just hallucinating too. You're putting your money into this argument that basically says that mass quantities of people are having this same hallucination that Jesus was raised from the dead. So let's take that off the table. That's pretty easy to discount. Then there's the swoon theory. The swoon theory is basically this idea that Jesus didn't really die. I just can't believe it, and here's why. These Roman soldiers were really good at their job. I mean, they were really good at making sure people were dead. Jesus was on the cross, and there was actually a moment, and you'll read about this in the Gospels, where they take this spear and they jam it into his side, and it says blood and water flowed from the wound, which was a surefire sign of death. And these Roman soldiers, I mean, they knew what they were doing. It's easy. All you have to do, check for a pulse. If there's a pulse, he's alive. If there's not, he's dead. And so there's no way that Jesus could have just swooned. There's no way that he could have just fainted and then 3 days later woke up inside of this tomb and then rolled this giant tombstone away. There's just no way that that's true. Okay, so the plausible theories. First one that I would say is could have happened is the myth theory, but let me tell you why I don't believe that this happened. There's this idea that over time there were these myths and legends that developed around the life of Jesus. I mean, he was a pretty remarkable guy, and I think that almost anybody who reads the Gospels at least admires the life of Jesus. And so with somebody so remarkable, obviously there's going to be stories that pop up around his life. And so, over time, these legends developed. And one of the legends was that Jesus actually resurrected from the dead. Here's the problem with that. The gospel accounts were very, very early, okay? I mean, let's think about the earliest book. This is not a gospel, but it has this story about the resurrection in it. So we can at least date this theory about the resurrection of Jesus to this specific book of the Bible, and it's 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians was written 20 years after the death of Jesus. So well within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses that were named in these accounts of the resurrection, well within the lifetime of them. And so what you have is this very early account. Now myths, they develop over hundreds of years. They develop over decades and decades and decades. They don't happen within the lifetime of the witnesses. For instance, let's say today is February 5th of 2021. Let's say that someone wants to make up a story about my life, a myth, a legend. They said, hey, remember February 5th? Anthony, he was out at Mount Diablo, and that day, he actually killed a mountain lion with his bare hands. Well, I gotta tell you, I got a cameraman behind the camera today. His name's EJ. And if you wanted to make up that kind of story about my life after I died, but EJ was still alive, well, let me tell you, EJ would nip that in the bud real quick. Why? Because he's here. He's an eyewitness. And so you can't make up a story within the lifetime of somebody who's an eyewitness. But here's the other problem. This brings me to problem number 2 with this. The earliest account of this belief in the early church of the resurrection of Jesus can be drawn all the way back to, some scholars say, within a year of the death of Jesus. Okay, so there's this verse. I want to read it to you. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I believe it's verse 3. It says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures." And so what scholars have determined is this is actually a creed that was making its way around the church. And Bart Ehrman, the greatest New Testament scholar and skeptic non-believer, says that we can date this specific verse that gives reference to the resurrection of Jesus all the way up until 1 year after the cross. So what we have is we have the early church believing that Jesus died and resurrected within 1 year of his death. That is for sure not enough time for a myth to develop. So the last most plausible theory is the conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theories right now are really hot in our society, right? You got QAnon, you got 5G, you got Bigfoot. I kind of believe in Bigfoot, not gonna lie. I'm just kidding. Well, am I? Anyways, here's the conspiracy theory. The disciples, they stole the body and they made up this lie about the life of Jesus. Let me ask you this question. What did the disciples have to gain from making up a lie? And this is why a lot of New Testament scholars and historians, even skeptics, say that the disciples weren't the deceivers, that they were actually the deceived. They didn't believe the disciples were making up a lie because all of them ended up suffering the same fate as Jesus, or at least tradition says that all of them ended up getting crucified, getting tortured. John was put into a vat of boiling hot oil. I mean, these disciples, they suffered greatly for this story, and not a single one of them said that they made it up when they were faced with death. In fact, if they would have just said, hey, it was a lie, I'm making it up, I don't follow Jesus anymore, well, guess what? They wouldn't have to die. But these men died for what they believe. In fact, Josh McDowell, he's quoted as saying this in his book, More Than a Carpenter. It would be hard to find a group of men anywhere in history who would die for a lie that they knew was a lie. So the disciples had nothing to gain from this. I mean, if you read through the New Testament, these gospel writers, they didn't pull any punches. I mean, they left in all the ugly, embarrassing facts about the disciples, which shows you they really cared about preserving the truth of this story, but it also shows you that this faith wasn't there to make the disciples famous. There really was no motivation there that would cause these men to try to make up this lie. All they would get for it was losing their lives and being tortured by the Roman government. So here's another problem. If the disciples lied about this, they were really bad liars. I want you to think about it like this. Would you name eyewitnesses in a story that you were making up? Like, let's say you're a teenager and you come home one day and you're late for your curfew. And so you come home and you walk through the doors and your parents say, hey, where were you? Well, what are you gonna say in a moment like that? Are you gonna say, well, I was at my friend Timmy's house? No, you're gonna be like, oh, I was at a friend's house. You're gonna make it really ambiguous. You're not gonna write characters into that story, because if you do, your parents are gonna pick up the phone, they're gonna call Timmy's parents, and they're gonna check your story. And see, that's exactly what these gospel writers do. They write eyewitnesses into the story. And Richard Bauckham, in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, here's what he says about that. He says, every time that these writers wrote a name into the story, they were inviting the readers to come and verify the validity of this story. Another problem with this is that the disciples used women as the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. And if you were making up a lie, you wouldn't want women to be the eyewitnesses. Now, before you hurt me and you reach through the screen and strangle me, let me just explain myself, okay? In that day and age, in Jewish culture, the eyewitness testimony of a woman couldn't even be offered as credible proof in a court of law. There was this huge prejudice against women. In fact, in Luke chapter 24, the women tell the disciples about this account of the resurrection of Jesus, and the disciples describe what these women are saying as idle talk. Like, you even hear the prejudice in the story. And so if you're making up a lie, you would want to use eyewitnesses that were more credible, especially if the crowd that you're trying to convince is mostly Jewish. You're definitely going to want to use people that Jewish people would think is credible. You wouldn't want to use women for that eyewitness testimony. And then the last problem with this story is that a conspiracy theory couldn't account for skeptics having their conversion experiences and their encounters with the risen Jesus. I mean, let's take James, brother of Jesus. In the book of Mark, it says that James thought that Jesus was crazy. So like, you have a guy that's very skeptical about Jesus, and all of the sudden, after these resurrection accounts come out, James, the brother of Jesus, has an encounter with the risen Jesus. His life is turned around, and he now goes from being the person that said that Jesus was crazy to being the person that is a follower of Jesus. But let's look at Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus was an intelligent, well-educated man who believes that he had an encounter with Jesus. He was a murderer, didn't want anything to do with Jesus. In fact, he was an enemy of Jesus, and he was out to kill Christians. However, he had an encounter that would change his life. So how do you account for that? Yeah, maybe the disciples made up this whole story, but how do you account for James? How do you account for Saul? Well, you can't. You can't account for those conversions in a conspiracy theory. I mean, what you have here is you have evidence right here that there were people that had actual encounters with a man that they believed was resurrected from the dead. Okay, so if this story is true, then we can't just move past it like nothing happened. If there really was a man named Jesus, he was an actual historical figure, he walked this planet and really did miracles, he really died, he really claimed to be God, and 3 days later, he really displayed power over death. That's a story that we can't just move beyond. Like, the only proper response to a story like that is to bow our knee and surrender to Jesus. And see, here's the story of the life of Jesus. It's a story of love. It's a story of forgiveness. It's a story of redemption. It's a story of a God who isn't just one that lives off in a distant point in space. Is not a God who just was content with staying in heaven, but he was a God who so desperately wanted a relationship with each and every person on this planet that he stepped off of his throne in heaven, he stepped into this world, he put on a body, and he died for the sins of humanity. That's how much God loves us. It's a story of love, and it's a story he's inviting you into. So here's my encouragement today. Let's say you've listened to this and you've gone through this whole journey with us, and you're saying to yourself, I think I believe this. Then the only response is to bow right now and to take a moment and say, God, I want to live my life for you. God, I want to give my life to you. I want to serve you. I want to love you. And I want to start a relationship with you. I would encourage you today to take a moment to pray. And prayer is simple. It's just a conversation with God. It's just saying, God, hey, I'm here. I want to love you. I want to give my life to you. That's all you got to do. And the Lord will come in and he'll begin to walk this life out with you. And the same power that resurrected Jesus from the grave will be present, working, and active in your life. God bless you. Thanks for taking the journey with us.